Kidney disease is one of the most common diseases in the United States. When you have it, it's kind of like they can track it very carefully, blood work every year, and they can see by the blood levels how well your kidneys are working. Nathaniel's was pretty well maintained. They weren't concerned about it at all. He had gone to a checkup in August. Mm-hmm. And things were pretty basically normal.
So they told us that this could continue this way the rest of his life, or there might be something that causes when he gets older that it may get worse and he may need help.
In January, actually it was January 17th, it was a Friday morning, Nathaniel came down the stairs and he just was really puffy, fat face, fat fingers, and he didn't look well. And I said, Nathaniel, we've got to go to the doctor, and we got to go now.
And I did go to the doctor. They thought I was just having a reaction to a medicine.
So he says, just go home, get off the medication, and they did blood work, and he didn't suspect anything but a reaction. So he says, just go home, get off the medication, and they did blood work, and he didn't suspect anything but a reaction. Early Saturday morning, Katie and I got on a tour bus with a group of Dutch students to take them on a tour of DC.
And I was planning on sleeping in some, but with them kind of running around the house getting ready for DC, it was kind of hard for me to sleep. So I took a shower. While I was in the shower, the phone rang.
Usually he lets the phone, if it's the home phone, ring because he knows it's not for him anyway, so he just lets it ring. So ultimately, the doctor got in touch with him and says, get to the hospital. Your blood work came back. You are very sick.
When we went to the emergency room, I walked up to the counter and told them who I was, and they all pretty much stared at me blankly because the report said that I was unconscious and needed life support. They had me sign a lot of waiver forms, release forms, so I could go right into surgery so I could start hemodialysis. After the procedure, they got the neck catheter in, and they took me right down to the dialysis wing.
So we're on a tour bus, just arriving in DC. It's like, okay, how do we get back home now?
So immediately, things were in a crisis mode. I figured the easiest way to get home would be to rent a car. If I came one way with that car, it was going to cost like $350 for a one-way trip. So when I rented the car, I rented it with the idea that I would take the car from DC, drive Katie back to the hospital up here in Harrisburg, and then drive back to DC, drop off the car, and then catch the bus to come back up with the bus. And that's essentially what we did, but I had about a half an hour to 45 minutes in the hospital with Nathaniel before I had to leave again and go back down to DC. So that was the first thing, and it was a shock to all of us. Nathaniel says he's going to the hospital. We didn't know really why. We weren't thinking kidney failure, but that's exactly what it was severe kidney shutdown. If you understand numbers at all, creatinine is a toxin that the kidneys take out of your blood. And so when you know your kidneys are working, your creatinine levels are very low. When you have serious kidney problems, your creatinine is about 9. When Nathaniel went into the emergency room, his creatinine levels were like at 16, which is like death. Usually kidney disease is this very gradual process. They monitor that creatinine level, and the creatinine, as it gradually creeps up over time, they know that things are not working properly. There was a mystery as to why his kidneys failed so quickly. And the nephrologist discovered why that had occurred, and she had consulted with a specialist in New York City. Well, the disorder that this doctor in New York was familiar with is a rapidly progressive kidney failure, and it's overnight. Typically, the nephrons, the part of the kidney that filters the blood, it's in different sections, and those sections will die gradually. Well, Nathaniel had a global shutdown. Everything shut down all at once. Very rare. There's like 16, 17 cases in the nation of this kind of disease. The reason why he was so puffy was that his kidneys failed. And when the kidneys fail, they don't take the bad fluid from your blood and put it into your bladder. So he was retaining tons of water. I think he had gained like 40 pounds over the weekend. So it was a shock to us all, kidney failure. And you can't live without kidneys. So they had Nathaniel was immediately on dialysis. And again, dialysis filters the blood, which is what the kidneys do.
Then he had to continue with dialysis. So what that meant is that he had to go to a dialysis clinic 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, for a 4-hour period to be hooked up to this dialysis machine. So from January 18th until the middle of March, he was on dialysis Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
So the doctor said, given who he is and his age and that sort of thing, it'd probably be better to have what's called PD, this different kind of dialysis. He had a machine that he was connected to every night in his bedroom, and that was every night he had to be connected to that. So that looked really attractive to us, but he had to have training, and that training occurred over spring break.
PD dialysis was a machine that pumped a sugar solution into my stomach and would sit there for 2 to 3 hours before being pumped out.
But that was the ordeal from March on, and it seemed to work pretty good for a while, but then we had complications in the summer and had all kinds of different wacky things.
He had a couple of different infections. He had a urinary tract infection in the spring, and then he had
kidney stone.
He had kidney.
Of all things, kidneys are not working, and he has a kidney stone.
Or they think it was a kidney stone, and he
had pneumonia.
He had pneumonia. So during finals week, he had pneumonia and couldn't go and take his finals.
When I look back over that whole spring, it's just phenomenal to think that here's a guy who's enduring so much, and yet he's going a full load of courses every week. We had a fun little event in the middle of the summer where Nathaniel got on this car kick. He wanted to get a new car. I hesitated, but it's like, well, this guy's been through so much. Maybe we can cheer him up with having him look for a car. So he was looking for cars online. He said, Dad, what about this? No, can't do it. What about this? No. I said, well, it's just around the corner. Let's go by. Let's just take a look at it. And so we went looking for these cars. And the first one we saw, we drove, and it's like, wow, this is kind of fun. It's not very practical, but it's fun. So ultimately, we end up getting a very impractical little car. And the day we get it, to get the license, get it all transferred and all that sort of thing, he says, I want to go up and visit my girlfriend in New York City. When he was in New York City, he had a very severe episode of dehydration, headaches, vomiting. Come to find out, he had 2 seizures. And so he was going to be there 4-day weekend. He was going to come back. Well, he went into the hospital on his day 4. I just was beside myself. I was on campus at the time. I got the call that he was in the hospital. I got a train up to New York City. Come to find out that all these things are connected to the kidney. When your kidneys fail, it leads to high blood pressure. They couldn't control his blood pressure. And his blood pressure went so high that apparently some blood vessels in his brain burst. That led to these seizures. So that was a very, very stressful, probably the lowest times that I can imagine, because Nathaniel could not stop throwing up, and he kept throwing up, and then he'd get dehydrated and couldn't keep fluids down. That started a chain of events for the next 3 or 4 weeks, where every other day or every 2 or 3 days he was in the hospital. And this was at the beginning of the fall semester.
Yeah,
so I was teaching.
Yeah.
So maybe I'd get home from the hospital at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd teach at 8 o'clock in the morning. I remember one time where I think I'd probably up most of the night with Nathaniel in the hospital, and when I got to class the next day, I just was feeling really down. And so as I was beginning class, I just started crying. Imagine a class full of students and your professor is crying. And because I was just wore out, tired, that sort of thing. And one of the students at the beginning, in front of this front row, his name was Wes, a great guy, short little guy. He just stood up and gave me a big hug. And that was wonderful because it broke the tension of our professor's crying, you know? And it's like I could get through the lecture, but it was those kinds of events and those kinds of experiences that just show, to me, the extent of God's care for us. And life was as good as it could be with the son with the kidney failure. You know, I mean, we had fun, we would have joking, and Nathaniel, again, being a lighthearted kid that he is, sometimes you had no idea that he had 2 tubes in him. The desire was to have a transplant. So we went to Johns Hopkins and we got extensive interviews, a day-long interview to see how likely a candidate he would be for the transplant. They said from 3 to 4 years is a normal wait time for a transplant. Now, if you find a donor, you know, a live donor, well, it happens as soon as they get that donor prepared. He was given a website through Johns Hopkins so that if people wanted to sign up to donate a kidney, they would sign up through this website. We know of 2, 3, maybe 4 people that did that.
There was a friend of mine, Ben, who was a closer match than everybody else.
I knew right away that it was something that I wanted to help with. I don't think that anybody was in a better position to help than I was. And it really was an easy decision for me. But certainly everything in my life lined up that somebody had to give a kidney, and there's no one I could point a finger at that should do it in my place. And some of those things were the fact that I had a very loving and supportive family, I had a very flexible work arrangement, and I knew that I was healthy and could handle a minor surgery compared to what Nate had been going through, but a surgery. One of the big parts of preparing for the surgery was preparing my mom for it. Naturally, you know, she was protective and worried about me, about my health, about the reasons I was doing it. She came around. There was more preparation involved for my family and for Johns Hopkins than there was for me. Nothing really special, just had to continue to be healthy. The night before we had driven down, my family had insisted on, you know, being there beside me during the process. I think we went in at like 6 a.m. Not much I remember after that.
Right before the operation, they took Ben back to start, and when they took him back, there was probably like 5 or 10 minutes of like, this is really happening. Am I gonna be ready for this kind of thing? But they basically wheeled me back to my operation room, and from there it was just kind of chaos because the surgeons are kind of running around hooking you up or getting things ready, and they moved me to another table, strapped me down, started giving IVs in me, and they said, "Are you ready?" And I was like, "Yes." And so they said, "Count to 3," and by the time I got to like 1 or 2, I was like starting to fade.
Johns Hopkins had prepared me for the worst. They really had. And it was not a big deal.
After the transplant, it was pretty smooth sailing. The first day after surgery, I was down, really tired, recovering. But the second day after the transplant, I was feeling much better. You know, I didn't feel really sick anymore.
For me physically, in a lot of ways, there are no long-term lingering effects. I think it boils down to, you know, like 1 month, 2 months that I wasn't supposed to do some pretty basic things like no lifting. Stay in bed, you're going to feel tired. But after that, I'm just not supposed to take ibuprofen, not supposed to go on the Atkins diet. And those are just things to do for my own health. It's kind of nice to imagine that for Nate and I both, we can just come away from this and move on with life like normal. It was such an easy gift to give.
So it was really moving during this whole time to get the encouragement from our college community, from our church, from many different people. It's hard to estimate the value of that, the nature of that community. Many expressions of care and concern, meals, cookies, all kinds of things like that was really just made you feel like you weren't going through it alone.
And every day I would have at least 2 or 3 people come up and ask me how Nathaniel was doing, or come up and say, "We're praying for you, we're praying for Nathaniel." So that was really encouraging, and that really helped, I think, support us and give us hope even through the whole process, even when it was really hard and the days that Nathaniel was really sick.
Behind me, these are all the cards I've gotten from people, just kind of saying like, you can do it, we're praying for you. There was a few prayer shawls that people made while I was in the hospital. There's some scarves and just other things, and I just really felt the like God's family around me, and I'm really kind of supporting me the whole way through, and that was a really big help and to keep my spirits high. And even when I was in Lutheran Medical, when I had the seizures, I mean I felt really miserable, but I didn't feel like personally down. I always felt encouraged and that we could like pull through and make it through.
One of my stories, I think this was like the third or fourth time we needed to go back to ER. I had been at work all day, and I had come home at 4 o'clock just to check on Nathaniel because I needed to go back to campus that night. I had to work at the concession stand for the soccer game. So I was only home for like an hour, but it's like I have to go home and check on him. When I got home, his blood pressure was really high, so I said, we have to call the doctor. We called the doctor. It was obvious that we needed to take him back in, but John got home just in time. It's like, well, should I, just call him and tell him I can't come in, or, do we both go into ER again? Do you go? Do I go? So John just said, okay, I'll just go into ER. I'll just take him this time. And so he took him. I went back to campus to work, and I remember I was walking out of the building on campus to get the van to drive around to the back where I needed to load stuff. So I get in the van, pull around to the back, and as I pull out, I noticed, and it was about 5 o'clock, and it was about dusk. It was starting to get dark. This is in September. And as I looked, there were some white puffy clouds, but then I noticed, and clouds are usually round and puffy, but I noticed this one cloud that was like a big, like a column. It's like, that is a really strange looking cloud, this column going up and like this pillar. And then God just brought to my mind, a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And this is a pillar of cloud of just showing God's presence. It's like God saying, my presence is with you in this.
Again, I just see God at work through this whole thing, to the point where even after we got a kidney for Nathaniel, I realized that, this event that happened in our lives, it's more than just a kidney. And I think of something like, those Sunday school stories of David and Goliath, where it's like, oh, everybody learns about David and Goliath. But really, there's something bigger. It's not just about a little boy killing a big giant. But David stood there saying, I'm doing this because God is a big God. And so many stories in Scripture, it's not about the event. It's about saying that God is a big God. And I really believe that even had we not come up with a transplant, that God would be glorified, that God would demonstrate himself in mighty and powerful ways, as he has in all this. And I would hope and pray that we can say, we love our son, and we're glad we have a son. But even if God were not to be merciful, but were to even have taken him, to say that we have gained so much from this experience. I would not wish this on anyone. I wouldn't want to go through it again. But having gone through it, knowing what I do more richly about God, his presence, his power, it's been rich. It hasn't been fun, but it's been good.